Right, so I'm going to show quick how to do kind of the tester strip with this. What I would do is just sketch this on here, just get about 6 boxes. So if you go once in half and then about every thirds here, doesn't have to be perfect. What we're due is to learn how to work with watercolor. There's a lot of different ways. When I first started doing this, I didn't really like watercolor because I didn't think that you could do much with it, and I just knew what I knew when I was a little kid of playing around with it. There's a lot of tips and tricks that are really, really good to this. So one of the things is when to have your brushes wet, when to have your paper wet, and all that kind of stuff. So the first thing that we're going to do is what's called a wet on wet. So I'm going to wet the surface down with just water first. And then I'm going to pick up some color. Now the color, you don't need a lot of color, and if you want to, you can go up onto the lid here. These are checked out to you specifically so that you do have those to work with and be able to do whatever you want with them. You can wash them off before you're done, but that way you can kind of have your color palette going up there. So I'm going to kind of work with pretty similar to what's here, so a little bit of blue and a little bit of red. For the most part, I don't want to do much mixing out here because you'll see that it becomes purple automatically with it. So instead, I'm going to mix my paint on here, and I talked long enough that it didn't stay wet. So I'm going to wet it down one more time. You actually want the paint to go for a swim basically on the surface and let it kind of puddle out from there. So I'm going to put my blue down. I'm not going to mud up my red too much until it hits the surface, and I'm going to let it kind of mix. So wherever it mixes, it will kind of do purple. Wherever it doesn't, it will stay reddish. Now the more that I would want that to mix, the more that I would mix it together at this point. So that is your wet on wet basically. You can try to get a cloud to happen. I'm going to grab a paper towel really quick.
There's that overlay.
So with the paper towel, you can kind of, while it's drying, you can kind of pick up a little portion of it, and you can get a little bit more of that cloudiness that happens here. So not too much, and once it starts drying, it ends up kind of pushing towards the edges, and it becomes what's called hard edges that happen. So that's your wet on wet. You always have to wait until that's completely dry before you go on to the next step. When we do the test strips that we're going to be doing, or the little test ones here, I'll show you real quick. These are going to be the ones that we're going to do as kind of testers. We're going to do 2 at a time, so you can kind of work back and forth with these. So those are the little ones that we're going to do as kind of postcards. And they make use of all of these steps, so you get to practice them after this first little practice basically. So the first one was called wet on wet. The second one is wet, which is the paintbrush, wet on dry. The paper is dry. So I'm just going to pick up some red and circle around in there. The more you circle, the more pigment you're going to pick up, the less that it's going to be kind of pastel-y when it's on there. So I'm just going to start here and do a little bit of swishing. This is just, you can do little dots or whatever. It's just wet on dry. A lot easier to work with as far as getting lines down on there and controlling what you're doing. But again, you have to make sure that the surface that you're going on is completely dry. If I tried to do this on here now, I would run into problems because it would fuzz out from there, and that's what I used to hate when I was a little kid. So you need to make sure that you're working with it correctly. The next way, which I never knew about until I was a teacher, was that you can get the surface wet, you can put a color down, and then you can scratch the surface. And so you can take the back of your brush and kind of scratch in, and what that does is it breaks the surface. These surfaces of the paper are, I'm just going to do a couple of dots here. These surfaces are basically, they have sizing over top of them, which is something that holds everything up on the surface. If you break that sizing, that's when it allows it to sink down in and create the pigment going into there. There's no way of moving that around now because it's really set down into the fibers of the paper basically. So, but if you want an absolutely straight, perfect line, that's the best way to do it. Put down some color first, scratch through it, and let it just go in. Now if you did this later on and you thought it didn't quite work the way that you wanted it to, you just go over it with paint again and it will keep going into those cracks more because you've broken the surface. The next way, honestly, doesn't work exceptionally well with the kind of paper that we're working with. We're working with a student grade paper, which means that it's a little less thick and it's got a little less sizing on the top of it. The professional paper, when you work with it, has a lot of sizing, and it makes it so you can actually erase that color right off of there again. It's one of the things, again, that I didn't like when I was a kid because I thought you couldn't ever pick up the colors again. Well, for this specific, I'm going to let that dry a little bit so that I can go back on top of it. For this specific paper, that's actually the truth because I'm not working with the best paper here. The next one that I'm going to do, I'm actually going to dry the brush, and I'm going to dry have a dry surface here. Now, you don't need to pull on the ends of the brushes. You don't ever want to do that. The more professional the brush, the less it's actually connected to it. The professional brushes are just squished in there. There's no glue holding it into place, so if you start pulling on the bristles, you're going to actually pull bristles out of it. So these are student grade. They are squished. They do have a little bit of glue in there, so they will do some, but still, you don't want to go pulling on them. And these brushes are in extremely good condition because I got them new this year. Do not put these into the sink. They do not belong there at all. These just get swished out and put back into your package, and they get taken care of that way each day. If you put them in the sink, they're going to get lost in there, and you're going to basically owe me for some brushes. So this way, I'm drying it out again. So this is called a dry brush. I let it splay out just a little bit like that, so that it's got kind of, I don't know, kind of edgy tips. I'm just going to get the tip of it wet and dip just barely into the tip, and you can do kind of scratching up from the bottom. And I actually got it a little bit too wet, so I'm going to splay it out one more time. And I'm going to kind of flick upward almost, and I can turn it to the side of my brush to get a little more of a flick upward if you want kind of specific grass petals coming up. Okay, and you can do this also for trees, which is really nice. Anytime you need anything to have a nice hard edge to it, you don't want to add the water down first. And I'm going to get the green and blue, since I don't have any water in them, they aren't going yet, so I'm going to get those going just a little bit with my other brush. Okay, I'm going to pick up the green first. Just dip the tips. There's two ways to do this. You can go upward and kind of tap and kind of rotate out when you come down to create the trees. So I'm going to do that one first, and then I'm going to do the other one next to it. Or you can go down. I'm a little more successful usually at the upward motion. So this is why we do testers, to see what works better for you. My upward ones usually look a little more realistic. But depending on the types of trees that you're working with, go from there. Now, I don't have to actually get all of the paint off of here. I'm just going to dry it out a little bit again to make sure it doesn't get too wet. I'm going to just grab the tips. I know there's more water in that one, so I'm going to be a little more careful. And I'm going to go back to this one. It's dried enough in the process of doing this that I can throw another color on it. The trick to making things look real in nature is layers. If you don't have layers on there and you think that it's going to look realistic just coming straight out of here, you're completely wrong. So it needs to add some colors. I would go back and forth on this quite a bit to get some depth to what I'm doing. So get my tree going that way. Same with the brush down here. I'm going to add, now that it's dried a little bit, I'm going to add a little bit more of the red into it to make it look more realistic again and get a little bit of shadows going on. So the more you do that, the better. And you could pick up another color and go on there too. I'm just going to darken it with a little bit of red. These boards, by the way, are paint boards also. These are specifically for this. Don't mix these up with the clay boards that we have in the room. If you go off the edges, it's not a big deal, but don't go painting on it all over the place because we want these to stay good for a long time. So the last way is the salt, which I need to grab really quick. I'm going to show you really quick too that you can kind of kind of flick some water at it, and I'm going to do that in the next ones. You'll see it's starting to push out the water. I'm going to go grab the salt for the next one. So on the salt, basically what you want to do is do a wet on wet. So wet first, a little bit of color. Let that work in. I could pick up a dab of another color to kind of dab into it too. And while this is still quite wet, actually, you're going to put some salt on it. Now, I'm going to have a thing with some salt in it. All you need to do is pick up a little salt like this. You don't need a whole thing in your hand or anything. What I have pinched in my fingers is pretty much enough. While it's still wet, I put a little bit down on there. You can see it already grabbing into it, and you just kind of wait a second and hesitate and see whether or not you need a little bit more. Don't overdo it, because what it does is basically pull the pigment in from around it, and that's how you get that really cool little almost snowflake look, or it could be water spray, anything that you want that kind of look to. So, and it's picking up pretty well. Don't disturb it at all at this point. Let it sit overnight and dry up completely. And you can see that this one's starting to do what it should do also. You can push the water around with it with just water droplets, so you can have some fun with that. So.